Welcome back. I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Review. This week we've got an interesting little design that actually uses vegetables. There's no flowers in it at all. And we are obviously allowed to use plant material of any description in our designs. And so this one, as part of an agricultural show, focused on having a class that specifically used vegetables rather than any of the other flowers or plant materials that we might choose to use. So as I said, it was an agricultural show. They're not particularly focused on floral design. They do have quite a strong floral design section, and that has been encouraged by a new coordinator that they've got. And so it was a chance to really showcase the range of things that floral art could present to the public. They're still in the early stages of organising how they display and where they display these designs. So the schedule came out with no space allocations for the designs. So I kept mine to the sizes that I would do for most competitions. And I will say, first of all, that the white section that you can see on the image is actually my identifier for the judge for this competition. So it's not part of the design itself. The design itself was a basket. Now I've got a collection of baskets that sit at the top of the kitchen cupboards, and every now and then I'll remember that they're there and I'll use them in a design. So this is a nice round one. It's got some twist to it so that it doesn't naturally fall to one side as it has in this image. And I thought there's no point in me trying to adjust that to actually make it upright. I didn't want it to be pristine. I wanted it to look like we had just gathered the vegetables and we were celebrating the fact that we had this abundant crop. So that was my thinking behind the design. And if you have watched any of these videos at all, you will know that the next thing I'm going to say is something that I perennially forget to do in designs, and as soon as I see the image afterwards, I know that I've made that error yet again, and that is, this has no base. It's not sitting on anything, it's sitting directly on the bench, and so that would affect the way the judge sees it in terms of incorporating that bench colour and the bench material into the design. You can't differentiate, when you're judging, very difficult to differentiate a design from the base of the table or the bench that it's standing on, unless it's on a little stand of its own. Now, it could have been quite simple. I could have just had a little round of a cake, not as big as the basket, just something smaller. I could have put it on a wreath shape, anything at all that would have lifted it and given some space between the basket and the bench itself. And the other thing normally that would happen, the judging on this wasn't quite as strict, but in a strict competition, if I had plant material touching the bench rather, I would lose marks, I would lose points, or I would be downgraded. So we have to, the pumpkin in this one is squash, depending on where you're looking from, is touching the bench, and that is not an acceptable way of presenting floral art these days. So I have the basket. It's got a nice cavity to it. I've put some coconut fibre in the base of that just to lift everything up so that it still looked like, if you looked closely, you could look down and see that there was still sort of fibrous material in the bottom, which would be appropriate for collecting vegetables from the garden. And so I've got a butternut squash or a butternut pumpkin, depending on where you are. I've cut it in half vertically. One side is inside the basket, the other side is outside the basket. It's connected with skewers to keep it in place. And then I've got potatoes on a skewer so that they stay in place, the carrots upended rather than with the foliage showing, and that was particularly so I could get some vertical height in the design. I've got corn, which I've opened up a little bit so you can see the silk from the corn, so that just gives a different texture and a little bit of movement to the design. There's some cucumbers and peppers at the front, and they also are on a skewer so that they're layered, or stacked rather, so that it just gives a little bit of different dimension to the design. And then there's some herbs for greenery tucked in through the back, so parsley and onions, I think. So I can't remember exactly, but I know that that was all of the things. And what I wanted to have was that it wasn't contained in the basket, so it's spilling out over at the front, it's spilling at the back, and it comes a little bit higher. The image cuts it off. There's a piece of corn or a corn cob that comes a little bit higher than the handle of the basket. The basket itself could be quite dominant because of the colour and the shape, but because I've created so much movement inside the space there with all of the different vegetables and the different colours of the vegetables, that you're drawn to that section rather than being put off by the dominance of the basket. The basket doesn't make it look too heavy, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So let's now see what Design Eye, our AI, has got to say about this design and what are its suggestions for improving the design. So first of all, a couple of overall comments. This is a charming and very readable interpretation of celebrating vegetables with a strong sense of familiarity and abundance. The use of the basket immediately places the design in a recognisable context, which supports the theme well. So the unconscious reading of the design is that, oh yes, a basket. We always, we need a basket if we're doing something with vegetables. And so that the choice of that basket has helped the interpretation of the design without me having to overly think about how to celebrate vegetables. It's just the abundance is there, and so we would be celebrating that abundance. The overall impression is that the design communicates harvest, freshness and generosity. It feels approachable and honest with a rustic, almost kitchen garden narrative. There is a clear intention to showcase vegetables in their natural state, which aligns well with the theme. So the assessment is that I have met the brief provided by the title, and as I always say to you, if you can present your design and when the judge looks at it, the first thing they think of is the class title, then you've done well in terms of your interpretation. So if we didn't know that the topic, that the class title was celebrating vegetables, and we just looked at that basket, we might think that it was something about fresh harvest or abundance or something along those lines, and all of that is about celebrating the vegetables that are contained within the design. And before anyone asks, yes, I did think about putting tomatoes into tomatoes, as we all know are a fruit. And so tomatoes didn't go into the design because I thought the judge will pick that up straight away because it being an agricultural show. So let's look at the principles and elements of design now. Balance, first of all. The design achieves informal balance with visual weight distributed across the basket. The heavier elements, the pumpkin, potato and onion, anchor the left and lower areas, whilst the upright corn husk and carrots add vertical lift on the right. However, the butternut pumpkin extending outwards creates a slight imbalance. While visually interesting, it pulls the eye strongly to the lower left and slightly away from the main composition. And this is just because I couldn't anchor that pumpkin completely against the basket, and so it looks like it's pulling away from the basket. And I think in hindsight that I might have been better having a few smaller elements rather than that big large element there. I think wherever I put the butternut pumpkin, it would have been quite dominant, and so I have to think about covering it up. And so perhaps where the half is inside the basket, and I could have brought some more of the cucumbers or the peppers or something else down over the front, or even the parsley down over the front of the basket to soften the basket, but to lessen the dominance in that lower, and the weight, the visual weight and balance in that lower corner. Rhythm and movement. There is a gentle rhythm created through the repetition of the rounded forms, potato, onion and cucumber, and directional lines from the carrot and corn husks. The eye moves naturally across the design, but the flow is somewhat interrupted by the abrupt projection of the pumpkin. So once again, it's the pumpkin that is creating this chaos in the design, and so we don't want that necessarily. We like to have a little bit of contrast, but not something that keeps pulling you back all the time. And the more I look at the image, the more that is becoming obvious that I am getting pulled back into that corner. Emphasis. The focal area appears to be the corn with the husk and silk, which is effective due to its height, textural contrast and lighter colour. This is a strong and appropriate focal point, though the pumpkin competes for attention due to its size and placement. So really I would like to have had the contents of the basket, so you looking into the contents of the basket being the focal area, so everything that was contained within the circle that the handle and the edge of the basket frames, that's where I wanted the eye to be drawn, but it isn't, and I can see that it isn't. It keeps coming back to the pumpkin. Never again. Proportion and scale. The proportions are mostly natural and believable, supporting the harvest concept. However, the pumpkin feels oversized in relation to the basket and other elements. The cucumbers appear slightly compressed within the space. Now the cucumbers were on a skewer, as I said, and so perhaps what I should have done is push them up a little bit so that there was a little bit more space in between them so that you could see them more clearly. You know, every flower has a face, every flower has a space. So same for vegetables, same for anything in your floral designs. The proportions, I think it's right. I think the proportions are all within scale, because particularly that, well, what might have happened is that the corn might have been a little bit out of scale if I had left all of them in the husks, but because I've opened one up and showing the silk around, it's broken it down into a more relatable scale to the other elements that are in the design. Colour. A harmonious, analogous palette of greens, oranges and earthy tones. Fresh greens from the kale and cucumber. I forgot to say there was kale in the back of it as well. Warm oranges, carrots and pumpkin. Neutral browns from the basket. This creates a cohesive and natural look, very appropriate for the theme. And so obviously you wouldn't want a basket that was painted or too highly decorative, but again, it's choosing the contents that fill that colour palette and work in an analogous way or even a complementary way, so that your eye is comfortable with the design. There's nothing that's jarring or throwing you out of the design or looks like it's out of place. Texture. Texture is a standout feature. Smooth from the cucumber and pumpkin, rough from the potato skins, leafy from the kale, fibre from the corn silk. The corn silk is particularly effective, adding softness and movement. And that's very true. There's nothing else in that design, even the kale is not as soft in terms of its texture as the silks are. And so it was a good addition to that design to break it up and to use that for some movement as well as the textural contrast in the design. Form and line. Strong organic forms reinforce the natural theme. Vertical lines, the carrots and corn husk, contrast nicely with the rounded basket and vegetables. The basket handle creates a pleasing arching line framing design, and that, I think, was my overriding thought when I looked at the basket, was that I wanted that frame. I wanted that very distinct frame around the contents of what was going to be in the basket. I had, as I said, I've got lots of other baskets that I could have used, some of the open ones, some of the gathering baskets, but it wasn't going to frame the contents as well as this one does, and it just keeps in that nice compact area that highlights what is inside that frame. Space. The design feels slightly crowded, especially in the centre. There is limited negative space, reduces the clarity between individual items. I'm happy with it being crowded. I wanted it to look like there was abundance. I didn't want it to look like they had just been placed very artfully inside the basket. So whilst I agree that it is slightly crowded, perhaps bringing some more over the edge of the basket would have still given me that denseness of the material, but given me the opportunity to space it out a little bit more. So something that I'll take on board. Mechanics and presentation. The basket is an appropriate and effective container. Mechanics are mostly concealed, which is good. The outward placement of the pumpkin, while visually bold, may raise questions about stability and intention. And I think the pumpkin is the fly in the ointment in this design. If I took it away, I still need something that comes over the edge a bit more from the basket and comes down towards the bottom of the basket, because otherwise it really does look like two separate parts. There's the basket and there's the contents of the basket. So I need something that brings them together. But the pumpkin was probably not the best choice in this instance. So let's look at some suggestions now. Number 1, consider integrating the pumpkin more into the basket or counterbalancing its weight with a stronger element on the opposite side. And so I think that I would integrate it more. I don't really want anything heavier on the other side, because then it becomes the battle between the two large placements that you've got in design, and you miss all of what's in the middle. So I think I would take the pumpkin away and then just start with smaller elements that were coming down over the edge of the basket, so draping down, rather than any large placements anywhere else in the design. Strengthen directional flow by slightly angling elements to guide the eye in a circular or upward movement through the basket. That's a very good suggestion. I think I have placed them in wanting to keep them inside that framework of the handle and the edge of the basket. I've placed them so that they were balanced and so they were fixed in place, but I haven't really given them direction. The silk from the corn gives you some movement and some direction, but they're not quite following that line. They sort of jump out of that line a little bit, particularly the peppers, and obviously the carrots do as well. Either reduce the dominance of the pumpkin or enhance the focal area further, grouping or slight elevation. So I think I have already decided that the pumpkin is going to be lost from this design and something else will be in its place. I'll probably still have the pumpkin that's on the inside, but I'll probably face it the other way so it's skin out, and just have other things that are around it so that it forms almost the heavy base when you look into the design. But I wouldn't have it featured anymore. Its days are gone. Adjust spacing to allow each item to breathe and feel intentionally placed rather than packed. And this is where I'd have to really play around with it, because there's that fine line, as I said, between it looking like it was an abundance of gathered plant material rather than artistically placed to form a work of art. And for this particular show, I think they would enjoy seeing it, the abundance being gathered more than anything else. So, overall summary, the design succeeds in telling a story. It feels authentic and grounded with a few compositional refinements. It could move from a pleasing arrangement to a more resolved and intentional design statement. And that's very true. There are things there that I could do that would make it a better design overall. The design itself placed second in the competition. The design that placed first was one that was a flat basket, and it was full to the brim of produce that had actually been produced in this person's garden, because that's what they thought you had to do, is use stuff from the garden. So in terms of its content, it was very impressive, and the judge for that particular year was very much more in favour of quantity over quality, shall we say. So there was no feedback. It wasn't a trained floral art judge. It was someone just local doing it. And so that's what you get at these particular shows. You know, they can't afford to have judges there all the time. And it's not good for people who are just trying to have a go and try out their design feelings a little bit more in competition. So what we try to do with the agricultural and regional shows is a bit of leeway in terms of the judging. So whenever I'm involved, I will take into account the fact that these are not people who are following the rule book necessarily, but they are exploring their creativity through floral art. And that's what I like to see. And I'm doing the same. So I will leave you for this week with our celebratory vegetables, and I hope to see you again soon for another design review. I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Review.